let's go ahead and begin now. So my welcome and a scene set from me, Jeff Gedman, with American Purpose. It's an hour Zoom discussion today. The first 20 to 30 minutes, I have a handful of questions for our guest of honor, and then the balance of the time open to you all in the gallery for your comments and your questions. So our guest of honor, as you know, is Françoise Mélonio, who is Professor Emeritus at the Sorbonne in Paris. She is renowned as a leading Tocqueville scholar. I know her because I have the pleasure and privilege of sitting together with her on a board called Tocqueville Conversations. And Françoise, maybe today, in due course, if you have an opportunity, you could say a little bit more about that group, but I feel obliged to honor and advertise that important group. She, Françoise, has been involved in a key oversight role, if I may put it that way, an extremely important project that goes back to the 1950s, if memory serves, 1951, in collecting and publishing the complete works of Tocqueville. This, she'll correct me, by the way, when I'm done, but I think this is important because if I have it right, Tocqueville, until the Second World War, did not arouse or garner as much interest in France as he and his work did here in the United States. But this project she's going to speak to us about a little bit began in the early 1950s and culminates next week in the publication of 3 new volumes of letters to the French people. The publication date is next Wednesday, June 2nd. How lovely for us to get a preview of that. And we're privileged. So Françoise, welcome very warmly from our side. Thanks in advance. And before we go to the 3 volumes published next week, June 2nd, could you tell us a little bit about this large project, how it's been resourced intellectually and financially? I understand the French government has played a role, and of course it's being published, these works, by one of France's most prestigious publishers. Could you give us an overview on the motivation and the content up until now, and tell us what we need to know about this before we get to the 3 volumes out next week? And welcome, Françoise. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to you all to be there. And well, it's a big editorial event for us because 70 years from 1951 to now. That's the last volumes. And before the this complete work editions, where there was very few books about Tocqueville in France. During the end of the 19th century and until World War II, the scholars had to resort to a very old edition, the so-called complete works, in 9 volumes, published from 1864 to 1867. The edition called Madame de Tocqueville edition, the widow of Alexis de Tocqueville, but in fact it was the edition of Gustave de Beaumont, his travel companion. And in this edition we had some letters, and all the American books about Tocqueville they studied about with this old edition until 1960, the first book of letters in French. So the complete works of Galliard, they permitted the scholarship about Tocqueville in the 20th century. And the American books on Tocqueville are, when they are not on America and only on Tocqueville and America, they all have as sources this Gallimard edition, which is partly translated in different books in English. This edition was inaugurated in 1951 by Peter Meyer. He was a German scholar, and he was a professor at the University of Reading. And the edition was then entrusted in 1949 to a national commission chaired by the director of the Ministry of Culture and the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France. And so they published several books, and then it declined, as it is very usual in that sort of huge editions. And in 1980, it was reorganized by the Prime Minister's office in France, and especially by Jean-Claude Casanova, a liberal economist in France. And this national commission was chaired first by Raymond-Aron, then by François Furet, the historian, from 1984 to 1997, and then by Jean-Claude Casanova. And the work has been managed by André Jardin, a scholar on Tocqueville scholarship, who published a biography of Tocqueville and died in 1996, and then I took the job. So you see, it's a scientific undertaking under a state patronage in France, which is quite unusual in France. We have not a tradition in scholarship about edition scholarship as the German has, for example. And it's a cooperation with the Edition Galliard, an old, very famous editor in France. And the commission itself includes international scholars, about them two great American scholars, Seymour Drescher and James Schleifer. So you see, it's really it's a collective undertaking, in fact. And it was sponsored by the state, and well, they gave some money, but not a lot.
So Françoise, thank you very much for that overview. And I suspect in the discussion round and Q&A, we'll come back to some of that. But let's then, if I may, move ahead to the 3 volumes of letters being published next week. Now, my understanding is that they are grouped, and you will correct me where I'm misinformed, but there's a volume having to do with Tocqueville as traveler or observer of democracy. There's a second volume, Tocqueville politician, my words, and then one as historian from his position of being retired and reflecting. And in my conversations with you, I understand that these things are very much integrated, and by looking at them, one gets a sense of his evolution of thinking on a range of subjects. If I've mischaracterized it, tell people, but I have that more or less right. Affirm that, and then tell us a little bit more about these 3 volumes that will be out next week.
Yes, it's quite true. The first volume is, the first letter is from 1822, so he's yet in the secondary school. And then this first volume, we see him as a student, law student, and then as a young magistrate, and then as a traveler to the United States and to England, and the writing of the democracy. And then, as you know, he stopped writing, in fact, when he was elected as a deputy. He was elected in 1839, and he published The End of the Democracy in 1840. And he was a politician till 1851, and he wrote only reports, speeches, diaries. So each volume is very different, in the topics. And then after he was thrown out of the political life by the Napoleon III, then he began to write history. So we can, in each volume, we can see how he moves from his family to very different sort of people. So the first, but Jeff, you can interrupt me here. But the first volume is well, each volume there are plenty of letters, I must say. It's more than 1,000 and well, nearly 2,000 letters, in fact. And so at the beginning, we see him as in his family background. You know, Tocqueville has never been alone. He doesn't live as a hermit. He knows a lot of people, and he likes to see all sorts of people. But at the beginning, mostly he's in the circle of his family, aristocratic family, and he has a very, let's say, it's very, very early. He would like to be. He likes to be both a politician and a writer. And we have a very interesting text in the first volume. He wrote a Persian tale for his mother's birthday in 1858. You know, a little like Montesquieu, Persian letters. So it's not exactly a success, literary success, but it's very interesting for the young Tocqueville because he imagines he will be the thinker of democracy and a great publicist. And he's very young at that time. He hasn't written anything, in fact. And so we see him as the he inherited the art of conversation of his aristocratic family. He inherited the experience of revolutions, and he would like to be as important as his great-grandfather Malesherbes. So that's the beginning of his social intercourse. And what is very interesting in that first volume is that before he goes to the United States, he has already the idea that France is going to be a democracy and there is nothing to do against that. So you see, when he goes in the United States, in fact, we see him, we see that he had already a lot of ideas, even when he is discussing with his with other students in secondary schools. So that's his first intercourse, in fact, family background, student in law, before the trip to America. And then in the second volume, he went into different circles. He went to the salon, which is a typically European reality, aristocratic reality most of the time. And we have found letters to Madame Récamier and all the prominent women of the time who had a salon, and he entered the Academy of of Moral and Sciences and Politics in 1839. And then the Académie Française. And that's very important. Well, now in the academies, there are mostly very old people, but that was not the case in the 19th century. And in the academy, he met a lot of people who were not aristocrats. He met the great historians, Michelet. He met philosophers. He met economists, most of whom he hated, in fact. He met foreign scholars, and so what we can see there is that he's part of the episteme of the time. You know, well, sometimes he claimed not to read the books of other people, but in fact, each week he went to the academy and he spoke about books and things like that. So you see, he's moving to intellectual circles and political circles too. And so the letters can show how he had political networks to his original background. And what is very surprising is that, in fact, Tocqueville's ambition was not to be primarily a great writer. His ambition was to be a great politician. But he was not, in fact. And also, he was a poor speaker. He dreamed of being one of the leaders of the opposition, or at least the thinking head of the opposition. And the letters show how he met with Thiers, Lamartine, all the prominent politicians of his time. And these people are generally bourgeois, because the aristocrats were not elected to the assemblies because they didn't want to participate in the political life in France. And he was a deputy, very active deputy. So he had a lot of letters with his electors and with the people in Normandy. And he spent a lot of time with them. And so we saw him, meddling with people, simple people, with peasants, with engineers, so all sorts of people at that time, between 1839 to 1851. And the third volume, so he's mostly in Normandy, and then he traveled to Germany too, and then he didn't want to. Politics, that's finished for him. So he's only interested in the how to explain the history of Europe, how to explain that Europe is not able to have liberty, and so he will discuss at that time with historians. He went to the archives, so very different sort of social circles at that time. So what's very interesting is to see this man, just moving from his family, aristocratic family, to very different people.
So, Françoise, thank you very much. I inadvertently turned my camera off. Two other areas I want to ask about, and then we'll open it up to colleagues in the gallery. One is there are new letters, is that right? Letters that have not yet been published. Anything you can say about those? How many are there? What subject areas? Anything of surprise or of great interest to you?
Yes, well, there are a lot of unpublished letters, in fact, yes, because we did it was a collective inquiry, and we had a thorough inquiry in public and private archives, private collections, and so on. And what struck me is well, these volumes light up in a new way his theoretical work, especially because we see him going from observation to hypothesis. He wrote very accurate and huge letters when he's traveling in his trip to America, to England, to Ireland, to Algeria. He went twice to Algeria, to Germany. He went twice to Germany in 1849 and 1854. And he hated to travel as a tourist. In fact, even when he traveled because he was sick and he had to go away, so he always wanted to do fact-finding trips, because he wanted to write about his trips then. So that's this very specific way of thinking, from observation to theory. And what is most striking for me too is that as a historian and a politist, he made great progress because he has been a politician, and so he has a special experience. And when he wanted to begin to write history, he had a sort of a practical knowledge about administrative files and about the way people are deciding politics. You see, so it's a very, very specific way of writing history. And the last thing I would like to focus on is that he's not completely an abstract thinker. There is an affective effective way of thinking. Let us just give an example. You know, he married an English woman who was middle class, well, low middle class English woman, and she has no money and she was not pretty, he wrote a lot of letters to explain this marriage, and it was a democratic marriage. And this sort of democratic sensibility, which he has when he married, is the democratic sensibility we have in his theoretical works. And that you can see that in the letters. He's a man of friendship, aristocratic sensibility, but democratic sensitivity too. And that you don't see that in the theoretical works, but you can feel that in the letters.
So, Françoise, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up in a minute, and the first person I'd like to call on in a minute is our colleague, Patrick Chamarel from our editorial board of Stanford. But Patrick, if you indulge me, I want to ask one more question, and a specific one. Françoise, this is something we've also spoken about. France, much like the United States, finds itself in the throes of, amidst a difficult debates, plural, about history, reckoning with history, issues even of reparations, and of course, statues and street names. Could you speak to us a little bit about Tocqueville and slavery, where the record is both clear, but maybe also a little bit complicated, and back to the new 3 volumes next week? Anything that makes you or leads you to think fresh, or are there new letters that reveal or illuminate anything in this subject area?
Yeah, well, in fact, Tocqueville was one of the prominent politicians about slavery in the 19th century. You know, he wrote the first report in 1839 in favor of the abolition of slavery. And then he was a member of a Great Commission in 1840 about the abolition. And then, as you know, that slavery was not abolished in France until 1848. Also, Tocqueville made great efforts for that. And in 1848, he was again a member of a commission about slavery and about the money we had to give to the slaveholders. And so we see that in the letters. He is in favor of abolishment, and there's no debate about that. But in 1848, he was in favor of giving a big amount of money to the slaveholders in order to permit to them to pay the slaves once they are emancipated. And there's a fierce debate in France about that now. In fact, even the people most engaged in the abolition of slavery were in favor of money to the slaveholders. because they thought it was not possible to have, well, in the plantations, to pay the slaves emancipated if the state doesn't give money to the slaveholders. And so the debate is about would have it been possible to give money to the slaves, to the ex-slaves, instead of giving money to the slaveholders to pay the emancipated people. In fact, there were two positions. Some people wanted to give money to the slaveholders as if the slaves were properties. And some, as Tocqueville, wanted to give money to the slaveholders because they wanted they wanted the ex-slaves to be paid, and the slaveholders had no money for most of them. So that's and the letters show how Tocqueville was really in favor of the emancipation of slaves. So he was a colonialist in Algeria, but he was not. He was clearly in favor of the slave emancipation. So we have to think both things together.
Okay, Françoise, thank you so much. So we have remaining 25 minutes or so for Q&A and round of discussion with all of you. Do me one favor as we go to the discussion round, the question round. If you're in a position to do so, could you switch your cameras on just for a moment so that everybody can see everybody, just as a thank you, that's kind. If you would switch, if you're in a position to do so, switch your camera on just for a few seconds. And hi, everybody, Frank Fukuyama and all the colleagues. So thank you for that. If you need to switch off again, please, you're welcome to do so. Patrick, you are first. You have the floor.
Thank you, Jeff. Bonsoir, Françoise, and congratulations for the great work you've done on my very favorite author. I just want to ask you, since you know Tocqueville so well, whether you discovered in those letters, new aspects of Tocqueville's personality, or adjustments. I mean, different ideas, or that you didn't suspect to find. So is there anything that this letter revealed to you that you didn't know about either his personality or his thinking? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, especially about his thinking in the years 1844, 1847. By that time, he wanted to have a newspaper, a new newspaper, the Commerce, and then several newspapers, because he thought it was important to have newspapers to be influenced into the political life. And at that time, he published sort of political programs, and we have published that in the volumes there. And he's much more leftist, I would say, at that time, than I can imagine with all his other writings. So, especially, he's in favor of a lot of social activity, and about education. And so it's very different at that time. And then after the revolution, well, it's different after the 1848 revolution. So that's really new, and we have published his programs in the volumes.
So thank you for that. Thank you, Patrick. So I'm looking in chat, and I'm looking for raised hands. One of our colleagues, Jose, had asked, directed to everybody, but that's you, Françoise, a speculative question about if Tocqueville were to turn up in today's United States, how he might be judging developments. I don't know if you want to endeavor or take on such speculation, but you're invited to if you wish.
Well, I won't say anything about the United States. It's difficult because he's a man of the 19th century, and it's useful to read him as a man of the 19th century to see how different we are sometimes, and especially what is the well, something are common and something are different. What is really different is that Tocqueville thought that equality was in progress, which is not the case in France today, especially on an economic point of view. So that's a great difference. But what is the first thing is always true is how it's difficult for French people to have a grassroots democracy. So all what is said about individualism, about the way the French people call the state every time they have problems. Well, that's true today. And what is true too is what is said about Europe. We always think of Tocqueville about the United States, but in fact, after his travel to the United States, he was mostly obsessed by history of the European history, and especially German, Italian history, and so on. And he saw how similar were the histories, the stories of these different countries, and that is, well, I think that's true today too. That's what the Europeans have in common, the difficulties they have in common. We saw that.
So thank you for that, Françoise. Let me turn to Bill Crystal. Bill, welcome. Great to see you. And I do want to say, speaking of matters Tocqueville in some fashion, enjoyed very much last week your podcast with Roya Hakakian, Persian poet, immigrant, democracy advocate, American, actually. So Bill, welcome, and we're happy to hear from you.
Well, thanks, and congratulations on the volumes, which is terrific. I'm old enough to remember studying Tocqueville in college, and I think it was just the first of the volumes of, the complete works had come out, I don't know, in the early 70s, maybe, I think. And finally, there was a reliable text, and then we got better translations and so forth. So I guess my question is this. I mean, came to this from political philosophy many years ago. So I have a bias, I suppose, looking at these people as thinkers and assuming that their thought did not change that much over time, that they sort of, and with Tocqueville, I think there's some grounds for that. He said he was a new kind of liberal, is that the phrase? For liberal of a new kind in that letter right after, when he's writing Democracy in America. And yeah, I think that's a reasonable phrase to capture what he was. But I'm curious, but maybe I'm a little wrong about that. And maybe the letters you see, I think the development or changes or reconsideration more than you would in the actual works, because he didn't write that much about America, as you say, for publication after Democracy in America. And The Old Regime is a very different sort of book. And then there's the Recollections at the end, but that's, about French politics. So how much do you think he remained basically the new kind of liberal he says he is in the late 1830s, early 1840s, a liberal but not a revolutionary, or a liberal who respects the need for order and justice and tradition, as well as a kind of forward-looking liberalism? And how much do you think he really changes his mind about basic matters of politics?
Well, he didn't change his mind, so that's he was very proud of saying that. So that's the first thing. Well, I don't think he's a philosopher. Well, he was a law student, and then he was a magistrate. And then as a deputy, he made a lot of reports, very accurate on political matters. And Well, I think from that point of view, it's very important to see him not as a philosopher. He's very critical about philosophy and political philosophy, and he's mostly interested in law and administration practice and well, things like that. I'm not sure it changed his mind so much, in fact, because what he was looking for in America was not America itself. It was only some points of view. It was how to have a peaceful democracy, and that was a lesson for Europe. And so after and he remained interested by the United States, even when he saw the United States going to the Civil War. But in fact, his real problem was how to become democratic, liberal countries. And I don't think he has changed his mind about that. But he became more and more accurate because his experience as a politician has given him a lot of ideas and experiences.
Thank you.
So you know, we have if I can say something more, in Normandy, we have all the files about his activity as a deputy. And in fact, he was a very good deputy. He was spending a lot of time reading the letters of the people in Normandy, and that's his experience, in fact. And he wanted to do something similar to what he has seen in the United States. So having a local democracy. But this experience, of course, he didn't have it by the time of the democracy in America. So that's the new thing for him.
Good, thank you. Thanks, Françoise, and thank you, Bill. Let's turn now to Jeff Wang, who has a question in chat. But Jeff, if I could call on you to identify yourself, and you have a interesting and relevant question to pose. May I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you. I'm in a pretty noisy environment, so I had to run away to a quieter room. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, François. I am a founder of a project called Project Agora in collaboration with a few luminaries, including the former head of state from Greece, for example, George Papandreou, folks like Kevin Rudd and others. And what we're trying to, in short, we're trying to do is have a comprehensive liberal arts oriented kind of experience for Chinese high school students so that they become more sure about who they are, a true sense of self, and a true sense of what their position in the world ought to be, can be. So that's all fine and well. And one of the ways we do this is modeled after Grand Tour. And so we've done parts of Europe, and we're trying to do China this year. And one thing that we've been, actually the very original idea was to drive them around with an RV, have them live together and experience great works, great ideas on the site of where the works and ideas formulated. So Tocqueville has always been part of our imagination. And so this topic for American Purpose came up, and I was really keen to just to get a sense of, certainly will be part of a signed reading for them. But if you were going to, I personally think affecting young people when they're at that formative age is so important, when they're either very confused or very disillusioned with all that's going on. And so what's any advice, whether it's route, whether it's pitfalls to avoid, or anything like that, I would be interested. This is more of an open-ended question of how to engage young people. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, in China, the Tocqueville book, which is the best known, is the Ancien Régime and Revolution. And the Comité Central, the Central Committee of the Chinese Party, recommended to read the Ancien Régime and Revolution, and especially the chapter about how dangerous it is to reform an authoritarian regime. Well, of course, it's a little tricky because well, the idea of Tocqueville is it's a very dangerous moment when you are moving from an authoritarian regime to a democratic liberal regime. But I think the even taking apart this sort of use of Tocqueville, I think the Ancien Régime is maybe the most useful book, Tocqueville book from the Chinese people, because it's a book about the transition from authoritarian regimes or absolutism to democracy and how difficult it is. And apart from the chapter about how dangerous it is. Especially the letters, Tocqueville letters from 1852 to his death in 1859 are very important, because that's the moment he's working on the idea of transition, democratic transition, and how you can teach the democratic liberal attitudes. So I think that's the real point useful, especially to think a transition.
So thank you both. I'm going to call on you, Frank, but before I do so, and before you disappear from camera, Jeff, thank you for that. Is there a place where people can go to learn more about the work you're doing, or if you were so inclined, would you put an email address in chat? Because I think people would be interested and possibly being supportive. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. And Jeff, if you chime in chat, that would be wonderful. And thank you both. So Frank, over to you. Floor is yours.
Yes, so thank you very much for the presentation. I missed the opening part of it, so maybe you talked about this and I simply missed it. But maybe 3-4 years ago, I did a podcast with Ben Judah for the Old American Interest, and he had just written a piece about Tocqueville's support for colonialism in Algeria. And the point of it was basically we should just forget about Tocqueville because he was a bad colonialist. And so the whole discussion was my trying to say, well, yeah, that may be true, but, as you said, he was a man of the 19th century and he did a lot of other very good things in his life. And, the balance shouldn't allow us to write him off. So my question is, in France today, what is the attitude towards Tocqueville? I mean, it seems to me a person in his position in the United States would be written off in most academic circles, and people would just say, well, he's like anyone associated with slavery would be completely discredited. Has that happened to Tocqueville in France, or is there still enough respect for other aspects of his career that he remains a respected figure?
Yeah, it has happened in France too, especially about Algeria, because he was a colonialist. There is no doubt about that. Although he was in favor of, at the beginning, he was in favor of the, well, he thought the people would be all the same after some years, and then he was in the opinion of separating the Arabs and the French, because he saw, in fact, it was not possible to mingle them, at least for the next years. But in France now, well, he is a colonialist and a thing like that, but there is a lot of debate about slavery and his attitude towards slavery. And for example, Piketty has written very critical papers about Tocqueville on slavery. And it's mostly an historical mistake, because in fact, he was clearly in favor of the emancipation of slaves. And he was one of the prominent anti-slavery thinkers of his time. And he made one of the first reports, parliamentary reports about that. And then he was in the most important committee on the abolition of slavery during the July monarchy. But the debate is about what we call the compensation, the money it would be necessary to give to the slaveholders in order to emancipate the slaves. And in fact, in 1848, Tocqueville, as most of the French people, already nearly all the French people, was convinced the parliament has to give money to the slaveholders so that they can pay the slaves once they are emancipated. And so the debate is, wouldn't it have been better to give the money to the slaves instead of giving it to the slaveholders? But it's not an historical debate, you say, because it was not possible at that time to give the money to the slaves themselves. And the difference, in fact, is not, the problem is not giving the money or not giving the money. The problem is giving the money because the slaves were considered as a property, or giving the money because we have to pay the emancipated slaves so that they can have a job and so that it would be economically possible. So it is a debate just now in France.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Frank, and thank you, Françoise. Françoise, I wanted to return to something you said at the top of the conversation. You noted that the commission overseeing this work since 1950s has been international. You mentioned two distinguished American Tocqueville scholars. Could you say a little bit about how his work then and now, if you will, has been received in other countries? I know we have a friend and colleague named Menzing Pei who wrote an article some years ago on how and why Tocqueville is so well received in China. What about other countries like neighboring Germany? What kind of resonance, whether it's in earlier periods or today, does his work have or find?
In fact, the complete works of Galliard has been very useful because it's a sort of archive for other countries, and so they translate what it's useful for them. Not all the books, not all the collection, of course, because it's a big collection, but they take part of it to translate it, and so the basic work is the œuvre complète, in fact. But generally speaking, in Europe, the Tocqueville's work is mostly forgotten till the World War II. So it's after World War II that we have the first papers in Germany, Italy too, and France. China, it's a very recent phenomenon. It's only in the 1990s that there is interest in Tocqueville, and it's equivocal. Let's say that the Communist Party in China, who had introduced some of the Tocqueville books, so it's rather strange.
So thank you.
Jeff,
yes, Frank, please.
If I could just make a comment on that point. The biggest fan of Tocqueville in China is Wang Qishan, who's a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo and was
Yeah.
the head of the Central Disciplinary Committee that was responsible for the anti-corruption drive in the first 5 years of Xi Jinping's rule. I actually had a long conversation with him in Beijing a few years ago, and he mentioned the fact that he was responsible for translating the old regime and the revolution into Chinese. But the takeaway, his takeaway from that was that it's really dangerous to liberalize a little, because once you do that, you begin the slippery slope, falling down this slippery slope where the regime falls apart completely. And he, used that then within the Chinese leadership to argue really against any liberalization in China. And so the interpretation of Tocqueville was a little bit problematic, but there's no question that he, it was an important book in the party's internal discussion.
Yeah, that's why the chapter they prefer is the chapter about Louis XVI and the danger, how dangerous it is to prepare reforms, because then you can have a revolution and then lose your head. So it's very, very peculiar.
So noted. Thank you, Françoise, and thank you, Frank. It sounds like he had studied as well the complete works of Mikhail Gorbachev and all that entailed. So let me, from my side, ask a final question. Françoise, I think that the third, you'll correct me, but this is from our conversations, the third volume ends with a letter from a French politician. You've made the note that Tocqueville was very much a man of the 19th century. I believe there's a letter from a contemporary suggesting that Tocqueville will have tremendous success in the future as an inspiration to future generations. I'm going to tack on to that the following. You can take this up or leave it be, but connecting a little bit to what Frank raised with Frank's debate, conversation with Ben Judah, it seems to me that among the many things we're losing is an ability to navigate ambiguity, where two or even more things can be true at the same time. You can take that up or leave it be, but tell us about the last letter and what's the indication argument about his influence and inspiration going forward.
After 1852, in fact, he was not involved in politics. So he went to, and he didn't want to get involved in politics. So that's, but he began to write history, and history was a way of writing politics in a different way. I think that's maybe, well, the Ancien Régime for me is the best part of all his writings, because it's a way of thinking the transition to democracy for Europe and for Russia and for a huge part of the world of this time, in fact. And it was very important for France and Germany and Russia too in the second part of the 19th century, because he was the thinker of the democratic transition. And maybe that's the reason why it's important after World War II, for the same reasons. That's the moment the people had to think about democracy and how difficult democracy is. And so, well, I have written a book some years ago. I wrote a book some years ago about Tocqueville reception. Sometimes he's very popular, and sometimes nobody reads him any longer. So it's very particular to Tocqueville. He has periods he is useful, and periods people don't find anything in it, in fact. And I think it was very, very important during the year 1960, 70. Now it's a little different, especially in France, because I think because we are more obsessed by inequalities than by equality, maybe, or well, so you know, the reception of Tocqueville is it's just like waves. It's moving all the time, and not moving the same way in the United States and in Europe, in fact.
So, Françoise, thank you so much. And everybody, if you're patient with me, Françoise, for 15 seconds, I'm going to tell everybody in this gallery that if you were free tomorrow, 12 noon Eastern, American Purpose hosts Franziska Brandner, a rising star member of the German Bundestag of the Green Party, on how to defend liberalism against extremes in Germany. And then on Wednesday, 12 noon Eastern, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, defending the liberal international world order. Thank you for your patience with that. But to all of you for your valuable time, what a wonderful group and great conversation and questions. Françoise, we're really delighted and honored that you spent an hour with us. Congratulations. I hope you can pace yourself. You told us earlier that now you're on to a biography. Will you take a few days off this summer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, warmest congratulations. Thank you for being with us. And to everybody who participated and joined, thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you to you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.